At just 19, Emily Carson stood out like a small flame in a world full of roaring fires. She had grown up in a quiet, unassuming town in North Carolina, the kind of place where everyone knew your parents' names and your high school achievements were talked about for years. But Emily wasn't like the others in her class. While most of her peers dreamed of college campuses or office jobs, she dreamed of the sky, the endless blue above, and the whir of rotor blades cutting through it. Her father, a retired Air Force pilot, had taught her to read the clouds and understand the rhythm of the wind before she even reached her teens. Her mother, a nurse with a heart as strong as Emily's, had taught her that courage often meant facing fear head-on, even when no one else understood. By the time Emily turned 18, she had completed her pilot training at the academy and earned her certification, but she still faced a challenge far bigger. Than flying, the world didn't take her seriously. The local Army National Guard base, where she had been assigned as a young helicopter pilot, the whispers started the moment she walked onto the tarmac. Men who had decades of service under their belts smirked at her spotless uniform. "She's barely old enough to buy a coffee," one grumbled, as she ran a pre-flight check on a UH-60 Blackhawk. "Wonder if she even knows how to start it," another added, shaking his head. Though Emily heard every word, she smiled politely but said nothing. Every day she felt the weight of their doubt pressing down like the heat of a summer sun. She was young. She was a woman. And in their eyes she was inexperienced, fragile, and unworthy of the responsibilities she carried in the cockpit. But Emily knew something they didn't. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, running simulations, memorizing emergency protocols, pushing herself past exhaustion. Every preconception they had about her was a challenge she was determined to prove wrong. Her chance came sooner than anyone expected. It was a gray morning, the kind where clouds hung low over the base like a warning. Emily and her crew were assigned a routine training flight over the Appalachian foothills. The mission was simple: reconnaissance, navigation drills, and a few emergency simulations. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as they lifted off, a sudden mechanical warning pierced the cockpit. Engine 2 had overheated. "Copy that," Emily said, her voice steady. Inside, her heart pounded. She had run simulations for engine failure, for rotor malfunction, for every possible scenario. But this was real. Her co-pilot, Sergeant Daniels, a seasoned veteran with 20 years of service, looked at her incredulously. "Emily, you sure you can handle this?" he asked, a trace of condescension in his tone. "Yes, sir," she replied, gripping the controls. Her voice was calm, almost eerily so, but every fiber of her being was alive with adrenaline. The engine temperature climbed rapidly. Smoke began to curl from the ventilation ducts, and the smell of burning oil filled the cabin. Emily's hands were steady, but her mind raced. This was the moment where everyone's doubts would either be confirmed or shattered. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had doubted her from day one, dismissing her as a kid with a fancy uniform. Now, staring at the rising smoke and the flashing warning lights, he realized she was no ordinary 19-year-old. Emily assessed their options. The nearest landing zone was miles away, a small clearing near a winding river. She calculated the glide, the descent, the angle of approach, all in her mind. Almost instinctively, "You need to trust me," she said, more to herself than anyone else, as she guided the helicopter toward the clearing. But the challenges weren't just mechanical. A sudden gust of wind threw the chopper off balance, sending a jolt through the cabin. Daniels grabbed the seat handles, panic flickering in his eyes. "You've got this, Emily," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the fear. "Focus, we're going to make it." The smoke thickened, making visibility almost impossible. Emily could hear the distant shouts from the base, but they sounded faint, almost unreal, like echoes from another world. The helicopter shuddered violently, the engine screaming in protest. And then came the first real test. A bird, startled by the low flight, smashed against the rotor. The impact sent a shockwave through the craft, rattling the instruments and making the cabin tremble. Daniels shouted, "We're not gonna—" Emily cut him off with a sharp, commanding tone. "Shut up and follow my lead. We are landing this bird right now." Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations, instincts, and memories of every lesson her father had drilled into her. She tilted the controls slightly, compensating for the damage, and guided the burning helicopter toward the clearing. On the ground, base personnel rushed toward the landing zone, their radios crackling with frantic instructions. But from above, Emily's focus narrowed. She ignored the fear, the doubt, the whispers that had haunted her since her first day on the base. All that mattered was the moment, the machine, and the lives inside it. And then, just as the smoke began to fill the cabin completely, she felt the gentle touch of the clearing beneath the landing skids. The helicopter hit the ground with a jarring thud, skidding slightly before coming to a stop. Smoke and sparks hissed from the engine, but the craft was upright. Safe. Daniels, pale and trembling, looked at her with wide eyes. For the first time, he saw her not as a kid, not as an inexperienced pilot, but as a hero. Emily didn't smile. She was already checking the systems, ensuring everyone was unharmed, but inside, a small spark of satisfaction burned. She had done what no one expected. Back at the base, the whispers had transformed into astonishment. The men who had doubted her now looked on with respect, some tinged with guilt. Emily had not only landed a burning helicopter, she had shattered the perception that her age or gender dictated her ability, but Emily didn't seek their praise. She knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was against the skepticism and the assumptions that lingered quietly behind every conversation, every glance, every mission. And she was ready, because Emily Carson had proven something more important than skill alone. Courage doesn't wait for permission, and heroism often comes in the form of someone no one expects. The aftermath of the helicopter landing didn't bring relief. It brought scrutiny. News of Emily's extraordinary feat spread quickly through the base, carried by whispers in the mess hall and murmurs over the radio. Some officers were impressed. Others were incredulous. They couldn't reconcile the image of a 19-year-old girl with the image of a veteran pilot who could land a flaming helicopter. Sergeant Daniels, once her harshest critic, walked beside her as they debriefed with the commanding officer. His face was pale, his usual bravado muted. "Emily," the CO said, peering at her over his glasses, "I want a full report on that landing, step by step. We need to know exactly how you handled it." Emily nodded, feeling the familiar surge of anxiety when all eyes were on her. She had rehearsed every scenario, every procedure, but now it felt different. This was not training. This was her reputation on the line, her life on display for the skeptics who had never believed in her. She began to recount the moments leading up to the emergency, her voice steady, but inside a storm of emotions raged. Pride, fear, frustration at the disbelief that had followed her every step. "Engine 2 overheated unexpectedly," she explained, pointing to the instrument panel in her report. "I assessed the nearest safe landing site and communicated with my co-pilot to prepare for an emergency descent. Despite the rotor impact and smoke infiltration, I maintained control and landed the aircraft safely in the clearing." The CO leaned back in his chair, a long silence stretching between them. He looked at Daniels, who avoided his gaze. "You were there. You saw it. Any objections?" Daniels hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir. She handled it perfectly." Emily felt a small, fleeting victory, but it was quickly overshadowed by the subtle skepticism lingering in the room. Some of the officers exchanged glances, their disbelief barely masked. They weren't ready to accept that a 19-year-old could outfly and outthink seasoned pilots. Back at the barracks that evening, Emily's isolation felt heavier than the smoke in the cockpit had. She had been praised, yes, but also questioned. Rumors spread. Some claimed she had only succeeded because of luck. Others said the helicopter wasn't truly at risk. Even among the younger soldiers, a quiet doubt lingered. At dinner, a few of the older pilots cornered her. "Don't get too comfortable," one said, a smirk playing on his lips. "That was a fluke. Nobody's saying you can do it again." Emily met their eyes, her jaw tight. She wanted to snap back to defend herself, but instead she said nothing. She understood something they didn't. Action spoke louder than words. And she would let the next challenge speak for her. That challenge came faster than she anticipated. 2 weeks later, the base received a distress call. A small firefighting helicopter had gone down in the nearby mountains, and local authorities were struggling to reach the crew due to treacherous terrain and thick smoke from the spreading wildfire. The National Guard was called in to assist. Emily was scheduled for a routine patrol that morning. But when the mission briefing came, the commanding officer looked at her specifically. "You're going to fly with Captain Harlow," he said, indicating a grizzled veteran who had spent decades in search and rescue missions. It's a dangerous terrain and the fire is unpredictable. You ready? Emily nodded, heart pounding. She knew this was her chance to prove herself once more, not just to the base but to the lingering doubts that followed her. Captain Harlow studied her, his expression unreadable. You know this isn't a training exercise, right? I know, sir, Emily replied, gripping the controls. I'm ready. The flight to the crash site was tense. Smoke filled the sky, turning the sun into a fiery red orb, and the heat from the wildfire created unpredictable air currents that tossed the helicopter like a toy. Harlow's voice over the intercom was calm but authoritative, a stark reminder that Emily was not the only one depending on precision. Keep the altitude steady, he instructed. Watch for downdrafts near the ridge. Emily adjusted her flight path, her hand steady despite the tremor of nerves in her chest. Each moment demanded split-second decisions, angles, speeds, approaches, all while the roar of the fire and the crackling of distant flames filled her ears. Then, as they approached the crash site, Emily saw the overturned helicopter below. Smoke and sparks erupted from the fuselage, and the pilot and passenger inside were trapped. Emily's stomach tightened, but she focused, relying on every lesson her father and instructors had drilled into her. Harlow glanced at her. You take this. You're flying the rescue, her heart leapt. She was finally given control. But now the weight of responsibility pressed down like never before. One wrong move, one misjudged angle, and lives would be lost. The helicopter descended toward the site, the heat from the fire pushing back against them. Emily adjusted the throttle and tilted the craft, carefully navigating the turbulent air. Flames licked the sides of the mountains, sparks swirling like fireflies, and she felt the sweat on her brow sting her eyes. Almost there, she muttered under her breath, every muscle in her body tense. The lives below depended on her, and then disaster struck. A sudden flare-up sent a wall of fire surging toward them, forcing Emily to make a split-second decision. She banked sharply, narrowly avoiding the inferno, and focused on positioning the helicopter just above the crash site. Harlow shouted instructions, but Emily had a vision, a plan, and she executed it flawlessly. The skids touched the uneven ground with a jarring impact, and the helicopter tilted dangerously, but she held it steady. She could hear the trapped crew screaming, but she blocked it out, concentrating on the delicate maneuver of lifting them out of danger. With a combination of skill, courage, and instinct, Emily managed to extract both passengers and lift off just as the fire surged again. Smoke filled the cabin and Harlow let out a low whistle. You did it, he said, voice barely audible over the rotor blades. You did it, kid. Emily's chest heaved, not from exertion but from a rush of emotion. She had faced skepticism, danger, and her own fears, and she had come through. Back at the base, the whispers changed again. This time there was awe, respect, and a grudging acknowledgement that Emily Carson was no ordinary 19-year-old. But even as accolades came in, she knew this wasn't about praise. It was about proving to herself, and to a world that had underestimated her, that courage, skill, and determination weren't bound by age or gender, and she wasn't done yet. The weeks that followed the mountain rescue were a whirlwind for Emily Carson. She was no longer just the young pilot who had survived a burning helicopter. She was now a symbol of possibility, and yet for all the admiration she received, there were still cracks beneath the surface, pockets of doubt and resentment from those unwilling to accept her talent. Every morning, she walked onto the tarmac with a heightened sense of awareness. The air smelled of fuel and ozone, familiar and comforting yet tinged with tension. Her crew still treated her differently, some with cautious respect, others with thinly veiled suspicion. Even Captain Harlow, who had once praised her skill during the mountain rescue, remained distant at times, his approval measured and cautious. Then came the assignment that would test Emily like never before. A hurricane had swept across the Carolinas, leaving entire towns submerged and trapped under rushing waters. Emergency alerts came in faster than the base could process them. Soldiers, firefighters, and National Guard units scrambled to respond, but the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. Emily's unit was called to assist in a daring helicopter evacuation, a mission notorious for its danger and high casualty risk. As she stood in the briefing room, maps spread across the table, her stomach tightened. The waters had submerged roads, collapsing bridges, and she would have to navigate strong winds and treacherous conditions to reach stranded civilians. It wasn't a training exercise. It wasn't a simulation. This was life or death. Emily, the commanding officer said, looking at her with a blend of expectation and doubt. You're leading this mission. Harlow will assist, but the decisions are yours. Can you handle it? Her chest rose with determination. Yes, sir, she said, voice calm but fierce. Inside, a spark ignited, a reminder of every time she had been doubted, mocked, and dismissed. Every skeptic had fueled this moment. The flight was chaos. Rain lashed the windshield and the helicopter shuddered with the force of the wind. Visibility was almost zero, the water below a roiling, dangerous sheet. Emily's hands gripped the controls like extensions of her body, every instinct honed by months of experience and countless hours of training. Harlow's voice broke through the storm. Watch your approach. The currents are unpredictable. Hold steady. Emily's mind raced. She had to calculate descent, angle, and weight distribution, while keeping the passengers inside safe. But it wasn't just physics she was battling. It was fear of failure, of losing someone on her watch, of being dismissed as inexperienced if she couldn't pull it off. Then she saw them, a small group of survivors clinging to the roof of a flooded house. Panic flickered across their faces. One misstep, one sudden gust, and the helicopter could be swept into the water. Hold on, Emily shouted, though she had no way of knowing if anyone could hear her. She tilted the helicopter just enough to lower the skids, careful not to touch the roof directly. The water surged around them, but she kept control, steady and precise. One by one, the civilians climbed aboard, dripping and terrified. A child screamed as his mother guided him up, and Emily's heart pounded, the stakes so high she felt as though time had slowed. The last person, a man trapped under debris, required a maneuver that pushed the helicopter to its limit. The wind caught the rotor, spinning them dangerously, and Emily had to make a split-second decision. With a deep breath, she pulled back on the controls and executed a perfect lift, extracting the man as the helicopter rocked violently. Harlow's hand shot out instinctively to stabilize the cabin, but Emily's skill held them steady. They rose above the flooding waters, adrenaline still roaring in their veins. The landing back at the base was triumphant but tense. Every heart in the helicopter had been racing, every muscle engaged, and Emily's chest burned from exertion. She had faced a storm, literal and metaphorical, and emerged victorious. But victory was complicated. While most celebrated her heroics, there were whispers among the higher-ups questioning her judgment, claiming she had been reckless, lucky even. Emily felt frustration boil inside her. Every time she proved herself, someone tried to diminish her accomplishments. That evening, she found herself alone in the hangar, leaning against the helicopter that had carried her through disaster. Rain still dripped from the roof and the lights flickered softly. She closed her eyes, remembering the burning helicopter, the mountain rescue, and the hurricane evacuation. Every challenge, every skeptic had shaped her, but also weighed on her. She remembered her father's words. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of it. And then she realized something. It wasn't enough to survive or perform heroically. She had to change the system that questioned her ability simply because of her age and gender. Her battles were not only in the sky, they were with the very people who underestimated her. The next morning, Emily returned to the base with renewed determination. She requested a meeting with the commanding officer and a panel of senior officers. The atmosphere was thick with skepticism, but Emily's gaze was unwavering. I've faced situations where every second counted, and I've proven my ability to make life or death decisions, she said, voice strong, calm, and commanding. I'm 19, yes. But my age does not define my competence. My record does. And I intend to make sure my experience and the lessons from my missions are recognized and respected. The room was silent. The commanding officer leaned back, studying her, while the others shifted uncomfortably. Emily knew she was treading into dangerous territory, challenging a system steeped in tradition and bias. But she refused to back down. Her words were sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. She presented logs, flight reports, testimonies from rescued civilians, and even video evidence of her helicopter landings. The combination of skill, documentation, and undeniable courage left the officers with no room to dismiss her. By the end of the meeting, the commanding officer cleared his throat. Emily, it's clear you've not only proven yourself repeatedly but also set a standard for excellence. The skepticism you faced is regrettable, but your actions speak louder than any assumption. Effective immediately, you will lead all future rescue operations for the unit." Emily exhaled, a mix of relief and quiet satisfaction washing over her. Finally, her courage and skill were recognized, not as a fluke, not as luck, but as proof of her ability and dedication. As she left the briefing room, she noticed Harlow standing silently by the doorway. He nodded at her, a faint smile breaking his usually stoic expression. "You've earned it, Carson," he said simply. But Emily knew the real victory was more than recognition. It was breaking through barriers, shattering assumptions, and proving that heroism came in all forms, regardless of age, gender, or perception. Little did she know, however, that the greatest challenge, the one that would truly test everything she had learned and cement her legacy, was still on the horizon. And it would come not from natural disaster, but from a moment that would push her courage, skill, and determination to the absolute limit. The alarm sounded in the early morning hours, shrill and insistent, jolting Emily awake before dawn. She bolted upright in her bunk, heart racing. The base was tense. Urgent radio chatter crackled through the night, carrying news that a civilian transport helicopter had crashed on a remote ridge just outside the mountains. Reports indicated that the craft was on fire, and that strong winds were preventing ground crews from reaching the site. Lives were at stake, and Emily's unit was the only one capable of mounting a rescue. She didn't hesitate. At 19, she had faced burning helicopters, raging wildfires, and flooding disasters. She had endured skepticism, ridicule, and the weight of proving herself over and over. But now the stakes felt sharper, more immediate. This was no longer about recognition. It was about life or death. By the time Emily arrived at the tarmac, the chopper was prepped and ready. Captain Harlow, her mentor and seasoned co-pilot, joined her with a grim expression. "This one's bad, Carson," he said quietly, adjusting his headset. "Fire's spreading fast. Winds are unpredictable. You ready for this?" "I'm ready," she replied, voice calm, but her grip on the controls was firm. She had no room for hesitation. Not tonight. The flight to the crash site was a nightmare in motion. Rain pelted the windshield. Visibility was near zero, and the mountain ridges loomed like jagged shadows. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the smoke rising from the burning helicopter below. Emily's hands moved instinctively, adjusting throttle and tilt with precision, balancing the craft against the treacherous wind. As they approached the site, the wreckage came into view. Flames consumed the fuselage, smoke billowing thick and black into the sky. Inside the burning aircraft, 2 passengers were trapped, screaming for help. Emily's stomach tightened, but she blocked fear from her mind. There was no room for panic. "Hold steady," she commanded both to Harlow and herself. Her voice was steel, slicing through the chaos. Then disaster struck. A sudden gust slammed the helicopter sideways, throwing the skids dangerously close to a rock outcrop. Sparks flew as the metal scraped against stone. Harlow shouted instructions, but Emily had to act fast. There was no time to debate, no time to doubt. "Trust me," she yelled, banking sharply. Maneuvering the chopper above the flames, the rotors screamed as she tilted, twisted, and balanced, her mind a blur of calculations. Every instinct, every memory of prior emergencies guided her. She had faced fire before, but never like this. She lowered the skids to the burning helicopter, timing it perfectly despite the unstable terrain. Flames licked the edges of the fuselage, smoke choking the air. The first passenger, a middle-aged man, climbed aboard with assistance. Then came a young woman, terrified, frozen with fear. Emily reached out, voice firm but comforting, guiding her into safety. Just as the last passenger scrambled aboard, a sudden flare-up erupted beneath the wreckage. The helicopter rocked violently, engines screaming, smoke filling the cabin. Harlow braced himself, but Emily's focus was absolute. She adjusted the collective, lifted them off just as fire engulfed the crash site. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The helicopter teetered, flames casting flickering shadows across Emily's determined face. She took a deep breath, guided the aircraft to safety, and finally, with a controlled descent, landed back on the base tarmac. The survivors stumbled out, coughing and trembling, but alive. The base erupted into chaos and relief. Emergency crews rushed to assist the passengers, and the commanding officer emerged, eyes wide with astonishment. Emily stepped out of the helicopter, drenched, soot-streaked, her uniform scorched at the edges. She felt exhausted beyond measure, yet every nerve in her body was alive with triumph. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Harlow stepped forward, clapping her shoulder. "You did it. You really did it, kid." Emily's gaze swept across the base. The skeptics, those who had whispered about her age, her inexperience, her gender, stood in stunned silence. Their disbelief had no words left. Not when she had landed a burning helicopter, rescued lives, and returned without harm. Later that day, the commanding officer called her into his office. "Emily Carson," he said, voice solemn but edged with admiration. "You've done more than prove yourself. You've set a standard no one can ignore. Effective immediately, you are the lead pilot for all high-risk missions. Your age, your gender, none of it matters. Your courage, skill, and judgment do." Emily nodded, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion. She had wanted respect, recognition, and the chance to prove herself. But what she felt now was something deeper: validation. She had faced doubt and danger and emerged not just alive but triumphant. But there was one more moment, a twist she hadn't anticipated. As she walked across the tarmac, reporters and photographers from local media had gathered. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward her. A young journalist asked, "How does it feel to be just 19 and already considered one of the bravest pilots in the country?" Emily looked around at the base, at the men and women who had doubted her, at the survivors she had rescued, at Harlow standing quietly in the background. And then, with quiet confidence, she said, "I'm not just 19. I'm someone who refused to let anyone tell her she couldn't. Age doesn't define courage. Actions do." The words spread like wildfire, echoing far beyond the base. Emily Carson was no longer just a young pilot who had landed a burning helicopter. She was an inspiration. A symbol, proof that heroism often comes in unexpected forms. That night, as she finally sat alone in the hangar, exhausted but fulfilled, she thought back to every moment of doubt, every whispered insult, every skeptic who had said she was too young, too inexperienced, too fragile. They had been wrong, every single one of them. And for the first time, Emily felt not just satisfaction but justice. She had turned disbelief into awe, mockery into respect, fear into courage. The world had underestimated her, but she had emerged victorious, proving that true bravery has no age, no limits, and no boundaries. The flame she had faced in the sky had burned many things: fear, doubt, insecurity, but they had left her stronger, sharper, unstoppable. Emily Carson, 19 years old, pilot, hero, and inspiration, had finally landed not just a helicopter but her rightful place in history.